Welcome, everybody, to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, which I think in some ways sets the stage for a new symposium that we will officially begin next week. But I think the spirit, the manifesto, the preamble of it could be said to be represented in its soul in what we will be experiencing today. We are, as was noted by an American revolutionary living through, or a British revolutionary in America, living through times that try men's souls. That was something stated by Thomas Paine in his Crisis Papers in 1777, when it was looking bleak for the cause of justice. And there was something needed in the spirit of the times that had to be invoked willfully by those who chose to operate consciously and sovereignly on the stage of history, that tapped into a quality of optimism that wasn't blind, but rather founded upon a concept and a deep appreciation for natural law and the relationship of human beings to the cosmos and nature's law. So that faith is a faith founded upon reason. It's not guaranteed that actions that ensue from said faith necessarily result in the successes that we hope they do. However, we know that when we embark upon journeys and ambitions and goals that are in tune with natural law, where the means and the ends are one and the same, we know that we are acting upon something which is true, that has true substance, that has the quality of immortality and the divine. And I think that is, even if our physical labors, our physical bodies can be made tired, we face tragedy and sadness, it doesn't mean that we're foolish, joyful idiots. But it does mean that there's a space for melancholy, but I think also means that there's a space for a deeper quality of higher happiness, of that higher order that people like Friedrich Schiller, Plato, Augustine, Benjamin Franklin had studied and developed within themselves. That gives us access to a greater spectrum of our creative powers than we would otherwise have if we did not wrestle with these things. So thus, the idea that we should be today optimistic about the future is not something common. A lot of people don't know how to think about reasonable optimism. They look for hopium, something to hold on to as they feel like they're suffocating and drowning. They have to just hold on to some form of, one or another form of hopium blind faith. That's not right. We should all be able to also simultaneously look at the dangers, look at the nature and the structure of evil, both in terms of those forces that are seeking to do very bad things, is also the evil within ourselves that allows that to happen culturally. We're all part of a culture that has been highly tainted. So nobody, I think, is better than the figure of Gottfried Leibniz at giving us that strong sense of why that reasonable faith, how it exists. I think his philosophy, his ideas had a huge impact on the American Revolution itself. And as I alluded to, in the coming weeks, we will be having a series of lectures dealing with the consequence of the American Revolution and the science of human happiness, as far as a science of political economy that would be tied to the increase of the productive powers of labor in opposition to those dark age forces that would rather keep mankind ignorant, divided amongst ourselves, and fighting. So without further ado, I am going to introduce my good friend, Uwe Alschner, who Cynthia and I have been inspired by, have been just really impressed by his work, his sensitivity to these higher forces and principles shaping all of universal history. And he is among the few I know who has really taken the challenge of plunging into the original writings of these great thinkers, including Schiller, whose class he gave a few months ago that I'll make available in the description box. A wonderful class on Plato and especially Gottfried Leibniz. So after Uwe's official remarks are finished, his formal remarks, like usual, we'll open up for dialogue. And it is all yours, Uwe. Thank you. You're now on mute, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. And thanks everybody for the honor of joining me here. It's my honor that you join me and choose to spend your time with the lecture I have prepared. So I'm going to screen share. I hope this will work. I don't have any video, but nonetheless. Now let's see how this. Yeah, there we go. So this is a lecture which was inspired by a series of articles, one of which was Cynthia Chung's article on Hellen Keller, which really, Helen Keller's Optimism, which really blew my mind. I hadn't really read so much about her before, and so this was really amazing. But it also prompted me to look into the whole concept of optimism, where this idea comes from, this term comes from, and this is how we decided that maybe it is now the time to show at least the preliminary results of this research, which of course includes Gottfried Leibniz. But let me also say that I am also indebted to Sam Laurier's lecture, which he gave on the Rising Tide Foundation a while ago. I think it is 2 or 3 years ago, on the American system. And there he touched on Colbert and also Leibniz. And I refer to this lecture for everyone who is not familiar with the biography of Gottfried Leibniz, which will not be many people, but those who want to revisit this lecture, I highly recommend. That there are also a number of other lectures or papers which I've used preparing this, one of which was Andrea Andromeda's Science of Happiness. Matthew has touched on the concept of happiness as a political idea, or even more than a political idea. So this was also important, as was another paper by Rosa Massa Esteve, who specifically looked at the impact of relationship between Peter I, or Peter the Great, and Leibniz for the development of science in Russia. Now let's look at how we got here in terms of this more narrow topic. And I would like to quote another paper which I haven't mentioned, but which I'm going to mention now, and which will feature in the lecture more prominently. And this is from Fidelio, the edition Winter 1999. Paul Gallagher has done a translation of a piece by Moses Mendelssohn and Gotthold Lessing, who defended Leibniz against the Berlin Academy of Sciences. And I will explain this later, but the setting is very well phrased in the introduction of that article. And maybe someone can read this lecture, if you don't mind, who would like to read. Oops. I can't see any of this of the people. So
Here, I could. Do you want me to just read it? Okay.
Yeah, please.
All right. During the 60 years after the death of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in 1716, his philosophy, his system of optimism became the basis for the idea of the pursuit of happiness, the inalienable right for which the American War of Independence was declared. But during that interlude in the 1740s and 50s, a thorough attempt to destroy Leibniz's influence was launched in Europe, originating with Sir Isaac Newton's promoters and in Leibniz's native Germany, centered around the Berlin Royal Academy of Science. Under Friedrich the Great's patronage, philosophers and mathematicians led by Voltaire, Euler, and Maupertuis promoted pessimism and cynicism in morals, entropy in physical and mathematical sciences. They attacked Leibniz more and more audaciously, most famously in Voltaire's Candide of 1759, a savage ridicule of Leibniz's idea of the best of all possible worlds. In 1754, a spirited defense of Leibniz was begun by Moses Mendelssohn, who became known as founder of modern Judaism and the German Socrates, and Gotthold Lessing, one of the founders of the German classical drama. The occasion was a calculated attack on Leibniz by the Berlin Academy, a prize essay contest, comparing Leibniz's philosophical and scientific work to a mere didactic, long and moralizing poem by Alexander Pope's his Essay on Man of 1733. Pope had been poet laureate of Great Britain for decades, famed for his endless series of rhyming couplets. Nearly all his poems were moral political tracts, disguised in never-changing meter and rhyme. It is interesting that only a few years after this degrading attempt to put forward Pope as Leibniz improved, came the first attempts to claim the empiricist Francis Bacon was really the author of Shakespeare's plays.
So I did not want to cut out this last remark by Paul Gallagher, but this is not really pertaining to this lecture, the issue of Shakespeare and Bacon, and who was the author of which. But it shows that we, of course, have the whole problem of the British Empire's oligarchical interests and machinations to deal with. And this is also relevant for this talk, of course. So I'm going to be touching on basically six areas. I will address Leibniz, the genius, and the effect of his work with a few examples. Then we will look at the system of the best of all worlds, which is, of course, the system of philosophical optimism, as it was termed. But this phrase in itself is a bit problematic, even though we today have no problem in calling it optimism as a system. But it was coined as a weaponized term at the time. Well, I will also, of course, then show how they tried to do it to take Lessing down because of the effects of his work and the impact he had. And the Berlin contest will be then a more detailed example of that. Now, first, Leibniz, the genius. So I think it is quite interesting to see, first of all, the definition of a genius. We always use this term, genius, but I'm not sure that whether everybody really has a clear understanding of what a genius is, how we might grasp this genius concept of a genius. And I found a very interesting quote in a 1984 film about Schiller, Poet of Freedom, which I also can highly recommend you watch if you haven't seen it already. It's an old production, as you can see, from 1984. So technically, it is quite ruffled, but it is very, very interesting, and it has this definition of genius. The genius puts conceptions of greater clarity into currency, and in 1,000 uncountable ways encourages those around him and gives a mighty impulse to the development of their own conceptual powers, so that they in turn can kindle those sparks of reason within others. Thus, the genius not only acts through his works, but only through his living influence as personally across generations. So, and this is clearly something which was spot on for Leibniz. He did indeed, throughout all of his life, strive to give greater clarity to the concept of the pursuit of happiness, for example, as an inalienable right and duty for every human being. And we will come to that later. So the question then is, of course, so what was he concerned with, and how does he view it? What impact did he have politically, economically, philosophically? What enemies did he have? And I'm going to venture a hypothesis at the start of this lecture, and this is that Leibniz was unassailable in his political and economical work. So his conceptual ideas in the area of politics and science and economy were really unassailable. Therefore, if any attack on him was intended, it had to come via his philosophical and theological positions. hunting him down as a witch or sorcerer was no longer possible after the age of reason had come, and he would have been able to defend himself better than any. So he had to be discredited post-mortem, particularly since his work continued to bear fruit, as was imminent. And this is my point here in this lecture, from his success in Russia in particular. And let's look at this a bit further. So Russia, under Tsar Peter the First, or the Great, had begun to move westward. Peter himself had gone to London in the late 17th century to get education, training for his officers, specifically in navigation, so seafaring. Seafaring capacities. But because of the vast resources, these were thus, with this move westward, also in terms of culture, thus were combined with progress in practice through, for example, in this particular Leibnizian ideas, which Theoria cum praxi is one of the terms which Leibniz coined and used. This was extremely concerning for the British Empire, because Leibniz also specifically had opened the strategic importance for Russia to investigate and build the bridge or land bridge to America. This establishment of Russia in America, beginning in 1732, can thus be seen as the straw which broke the camel's back, triggering active containment of Leibnizian scientific and philosophical ideas. Because when Leibniz died in 1716, he was really he was well respected, and hardly anyone was daring to attack him openly. But this changed later, and it's in particular after Russia set foot on the American continent. This is my thesis. So Leibniz and Peter the Great did meet for the first time in October of 1711 at Torgau in a small Saxon town on the river Elbe in Germany. And why? Why there? Why did a Russian Tsar meet with a Hanoverian minister in Saxony? So it happens that there was a wedding which the Hanoverian, he had forbidden his daughter to marry into France, and he went on to have her become the wife of the Tsarevich, so the son of Peter I, Alexei. And then the Nordic War was fought, which prevented the Tsar to go all the way to Hanover in the west of Germany. So they made this decision to meet halfway, basically, at Torgau, where the wife of the King of Saxony was also responsible for the education of the Hanoverian princes, and that's why they went to Torgau. Torgau is a place which is really beautiful, and this is the castle Hartfels, or Hard Rock, even in English translated would mean Hard Rock. It's right on the river Elbe. It's a beautiful castle. So the wife of the king resided in this castle, and as you can see, there is beautiful architecture. There's this Renaissance tower, which is very interesting, also from its architecture and from its design. And as you can see here, some photos which I couldn't resist to showing, because this is a staircase which is really beautiful and architecturally very challenging to build. And so following this meeting of at Torgau, Leibniz stayed in correspondence with the Czar, and then he wrote particularly about the setting up of a Russian Academy of Science. And maybe someone else can read this if you like, Gerald, or who's...
Yes, I would like to read it, Uwe. Although I have often served in public affairs and the administration of justice, and am sometimes consulted by great princes in these matters, I nevertheless consider the arts and sciences to be higher, because through them the glory of God and the best interests of the whole human race are constantly promoted. For it is in the sciences and knowledge of nature and art that the wonders of God, his power, wisdom, and goodness are most evident. And the arts and sciences are also the true treasure of the human race, because through them art becomes powerful over nature, and because through them the well-founded nations are distinguished from the barbarian ones.
Would you like to continue? Or someone else?
Okay, yes. That is why I have loved and pursued science from an early age, and have also had the good fortune, despite many other business matters, to make various extraordinary discoveries, which have been highly praised in the public records by impartial and renowned people. I also lacked nothing but a great lord who just wanted to take sufficient care of the matter. And I now hope to have found this in your imperial majesty, as in your great empire, you can and will make, almost without effort and expense, the most excellent arrangements for this quite easily.
Please continue, Chair.
By such heroic endeavors, your grand Tsarist majesty will promote the benefit and welfare of not only the current, but also countless future generations of people, and will be useful and beneficial to the whole human race, but especially to the Russians and all other Slavic nations, and accomplish far more for them than Fohi did for the Chinese, Hermes for the Egyptian, Zerdust in High Asia, Ermin for the High Germans, Odin for the North Germans, Almansor for the Saracens.
Thank you. There are a couple of more slides, so if someone else would like to pick up in case Gerald gets tired, but otherwise I'm very grateful if you would continue.
It seems to be God's will that the sciences should circle the earth and now also come to Cynthia, and that God has providenced your majesty as an instrument for this, since you take the best from Europe on the one hand and from China on the other. And what both accomplished, you can improve through proper organization. Because in your empire, everything concerning studies is still new, and, as it were, a blank sheet. So an uncountable number of mistakes can be avoided, which in Europe and China have gradually and unnoticedly crept in. And it is well known that a palace that is built from scratch comes out better than one that has been built and repaired on for many centuries, and which also has been changed a lot. This new and great work of art includes libraries, museums or curiosity cabinets, workshops for models and art objects, chemical laboratories, and astronomical observatories. But you don't need everything at once, but go step by step. And there are suggestions for how to get to the most useful ones quickly without extra costs. The principal thing, however, is to procure such people as are suited to the great purpose, who will travel comfortably and from various places to your Majesty's realm, and who will teach young people there faithfully. For since supplies are cheap in Russia, one does not need very much money for those who will settle in the country.
Second but last.
I shall consider it a great honor, pleasure, and merit to be of service to your grand Tsarist Majesty in such a praiseworthy and God-pleasing work. For I am not one of those who are fixated on their fatherland or some other particular nation, but I am concerned for the benefit of the whole human race, for I consider heaven to be the fatherland, and all well-meaning people to be its citizen. And I would rather do a lot of good for the Russians than a little for the Germans or other Europeans, even if I sit with the latter in honor, wealth, and tranquility, without thereby benefiting others much, because my inclination and desire is for the common good.
So this is the last chart for this quote.
To this end, I have already conducted extensive correspondence in Europe and as far as China, and I am not only a long-standing member of the Royal French and English societies, but also direct as Praeses the Royal Prussian Society of Sciences. The king founded such a society in Berlin on my recommendation, and I have provided such assistance to the institution that it costs the king almost nothing to maintain. Not only could much better things be done like this, however, but much more will be done in your Majesty's great country, and if action is taken soon.
Thank you very much, Gerald. This was quite an extensive bit of reading, but I chose to have almost the whole letter from January 16th of 1712 translated and read, because I think it gives a very good insight into Leibniz's situation as well as into his frame of mind, so his motivation and his rationale. The situation, I think, is very interesting because at 1712, he was basically running out of patience with, or running out of support with his Hanoverian benefactors, because the widow of the old and by now dead Duke Ernst August, she had died also, and therefore it was now George Ludwig the Duke, who would later become King George the First of England, who was his patron, so to speak, and Leibniz felt very clearly that patience or the will to support him there was running out. So therefore, this was also quite an elaborate letter of application from Leibniz to the Tsar, which succeeded in the way that he was taken on as a counselor on to the Imperial Russian services, and he was paid a salary from then on. And this is important because even though that the academy, which they have correspondence over in this letter, did not come to be effectively opened during the lifetime of both Leibniz and Tsar Peter, it was still very, very important that Leibniz extend those proposals to the Russian Tsar, and the effect will be seen. Excuse me. So before Leibniz met Peter, he had been, as I said, been a he had been sponsored by the Hanoverians, even though the king of Prussia was effectively his benefactress, but she was of Hanoverian descent. Potsdam was the capital of Prussia at the time. Berlin was not really very famous. It was two cities, and Köln, the other part, which is still today a district of Berlin, even though it is called Neukölln. It was where the residential palace was situated and where the king signed the edicts which he issued. Prussia, among all the other German princedoms, was deemed to be a little bit backward and provincial. Hanover was for that part was not yet an electorate, so it was a power play also, because the Hanoverians wanted to become prince electors within the Holy German Empire, but they were a member of the Guelphs. I mean, they were the Guelph house of Hanover. So this is why the Duke prevented his daughter Sophie Charlotte to marrying to France, and the Elector of Brandenburg built her a palace in what is now Berlin, was then Lietzenburg, and today is called Charlottenburg due to Sophie Charlotte. And it was at her court where a lot of discussions and culture was being done. And this is what later her grandson, Frederick the Great, had to say about her. She was a princess of distinguished merit who combined all the charms. Sorry, I cannot read this word because there's this box in the top corner which I cannot make go away. Sorry.
All the charms of her sex.
With the gifts of the spirit and the light of reason, she had traveled in her youth in Italy and France under the guidance of her parents. She was destined for the throne of France. Louis XIV was touched by her beauty, but political reasons prevented the marriage. This princess brought to Prussia the spirit of society, the true politeness and love of the arts and sciences. She founded the Royal Academy. She called Leibniz and many other scholars to her court. Her curiosity wanted to grasp the first principles of things. Leibniz, whom she pressed on the subject, said, "Madame, there is no way to satisfy you. You want to know the why of the wherefore." Charlottenburg was the rendezvous of people of taste. All sorts of infinitely varied entertainments and festivities made this day delightful and this court brilliant. Sophie Charlotte had a strong soul, her religion was exhausted, her mood gentle, her mind adorned with the reading of all good French and Italian books. And as it said, she brought Leibniz to Berlin, and with Leibniz philosophy, and with philosophy, you can say she also brought Mendelssohn to Berlin, but this is not quite all of the truth, because Mendelssohn, of course, went for reasons to Berlin where he did not, I think, believe that he would become a distinguished philosopher anyway. So Sophie Charlotte, she engaged Leibniz to provide arguments against the leading encyclopedians, such as Pierre Bayle, on the nature of God. And this is how it all came about. Leipzig developed from these counsel, from this reasoning to the Queen. Later, he developed his Theodicy, which is a word which he coined from the Latin theos and dicec. So it's the justice of God, which lays out what became known as the Leibniz system of optimism, and which, as Leibniz explains to Bartholomew de Bos, is like a certain kind of science, namely the doctrine of the justice, that is, of the wisdom together with the goodness of God. So who is Pierre Bayle, who was mentioned here? Bayle was a Calvinist theologian and professor from France. He was trained at Toulouse at a Jesuit college, where he converted to Catholicism in 1669, even though his father was a Huguenot, so a Calvinist pastor. Of course, this was the time where there was religious conflict, and there may be many reasons why one would convert, and even later Bayle relapsed back to Calvinism. But I think it is of importance that he was trained at the Jesuit college and then fled to Geneva, where he also became introduced to Cartesian philosophy. He returned to France and became professor in Sedan in the Champagne. And after the Edict of Nantes was revoked, Bayle fled to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where he became professor at the École Illustre, which was a sort of a school for the sons and, I think it was sons at the day, of Rotterdam, leading up to university. After he was accused of being the author of a pamphlet criticizing William of Orange, who later was then to become King of Great Britain, he lost his job at the École. And that's when he started to publish the dictionary, which was a biographical work, and rather not so much a dictionary of sorts, but it was very widely read, and it was very important at the time. Also, it spurred, of course, religious controversy, which I think we can say is something which the Jesuits have been known for to be doing. So this is the work in question, the Dictionnaire historique et critique by Monsieur Bayle. And this is what his German publisher and translator Gottsched had to say about Leibniz being the antidote to Bayle. So Gottsched said, and since Bayle in particular was completely lost in these last concepts, what is, oops, sorry, Matt, can you help me? Awesome.
What is meant is in his denunciation.
Of course, omnipotence, as arbitrariness. And from this almost,
all objections
against divine goodness were taken, without considering that God, besides the highest power and goodness, also possesses an infinite wisdom that does not let him do everything he wants and is able to do, but rather guides all his actions to the most perfect of intentions. I have always believed that no better antidote can be found against Bayle, Bayle's doubts and objections than the Leibnizian Theodicy, if it is read with due attention and in its entirety. There is nothing more natural than this, since it is well known that the learned Baron von Leibniz wrote this book at the request of a princess as great as she was sharp, i.e. the Prussian Queen Sophie Charlotte, solely with the intention of protecting the goodness and justice of God against Bayle's objections. Now, let's come to Leibniz himself. He said on the Theodicy that the greater part of this work, again, I have to get maybe someone can tell me how I.
All right, you can physically move whatever that thing is that's obstructing your vision.
I can't. My mouse doesn't show, so I cannot see.
Doesn't show. Okay, all right. I'll just try to be on guard. So the greater part of this work was composed in bits and pieces when I was at the court of the late Queen of Prussia, where these topics were often raised on the occasion of Mr. Bayle's dictionary and other writings. I'll let you continue.
Which were much read there. In our discussions, I usually replied to Mr. Bayle's objections and showed the Queen that they were not as strong as certain anti-religious people wanted to believe. Her Majesty often commanded me to put my replies down in writing so that she could consider them carefully. After the death of this great princess, friends who knew about these writings encouraged me to put them together and expand them, and I turned them into the work I mentioned above, which is a reasonably large octavo. This he wrote in 1710. So what is this? The Leibnizian system of the best of all worlds. So I'm not going to claim that I will be able to really present it in its entirety and accurately, but I will try my best. So this is on happiness first. Leibniz wrote, "Happiness is to people what perfection is to beings in general,
And if the ultimate
explanation of the existence of the real world is the decree that it should have the greatest perfection that it can, then the ultimate aim for the moral world, so the city of God, the noblest part of the universe, should be to infuse it with the greatest possible happiness." This he wrote on metaphysics. And Andrea Andromidas, whose article I have quoted, said, "It does not mean that one will create paradise on earth, but it means that through all storms one is obliged to serve the common good, or in other words, to contribute to the progress of all humanity, even to the development of the entire cosmos." And we can, by remembering the quotes from the letters to the Czar, we can, I think, have a good understanding of what is meant by that. Yeah, I would have to stop the recording to get this window away, but I think we can do that. So what is evil according to Leibniz? Evil may be taken metaphysically, physically, and morally. Metaphysically, evil consists in mere imperfection, physical evil in suffering, and moral evil in sin. Now, although physical evil and moral evil be not necessary, it is enough that by virtue of the eternal verities they be possible. And as this vast region of verities contains all possibilities, it is necessary that there be an infinitude of possible worlds, that evil enter into divers of them, and that even the best of all contain a measure thereof. Thus, God has been induced to permit evil. And this, of course, this has been one of the points where Leibniz later was attacked by various camps, so to speak, and nearly all those attacks were basically not genuine because they tried to get to him for other reasons. Well, let's continue. Of course, in all of this, Leibniz is drawing on Augustinian theology, and also Augustinian had a theodicy which, viewed from an ontological perspective, said that evil is the absence of proper being. So-called evil is either sin, i.e. the wrongdoing of free rational agents, moral evil, or the just punishment inflicted on sinners by God, physical or natural evils. And particular evils are constituent elements of the universe seen as a whole. They contribute to the order and beauty of creation, as well as to the emphasizing and bringing forth of goodness. Ed, can you read the first two lines, please?
Yep. A summary delineation of the theory is: God, the pinnacle of being and goodness, created the world out of nothing. As the work of omnipotent goodness, everything that exists is wholly good.
Because being is goodness, evil, the contrary of goodness, cannot possess the metaphysical attribute of being. Consequently, in ontological terms, evil is to be defined as non-being. Augustine articulates the thesis in several passages, for example, in the Confessiones, while reporting on his youth as a follower of the Manichaean sect. He said, "I did not yet know that evil was nothing but a privation of good, that indeed it has no being." Later he said, "Evil then, the origin of which I had been seeking, has no substance at all, for if it were a substance, it would be good." And in De Civitate Dei, he said, there is no such entity in nature as evil. Evil is merely a name for the privation of good. Sorry. Augustine's denial of the substantial existence of evil obviously does not imply that he or Christian tradition or Leibniz, for that matter, maintains that no evil in the world happens. It does mean, though, that there is neither an iniquitous substance or a supernatural entity behind the behavior and the distress that we call evil, a pure evil or Manichaean antagonist to God, whence all imperial evil emanate. Nor does it mean in the realm of creation something that could be considered inherently devoid of goodness or simply defective. Well, we use the word evil in two senses. First, when we say that someone has done evil, and second, when we say that someone has suffered evil. But if you know or believe that God is good, and it is not right to believe otherwise, then he does no evil. On the other hand, if we acknowledge that God is just and it is impious to deny it, then he rewards the good and punishes the wicked. Those punishments are certainly evils for those who suffer them. Therefore, if no one is punished unjustly, and we must believe this, since we believe that this universe is governed by divine providence, it follows that God is a cause for the second kind of evil, but in no way causes the first. Back to Leibniz. He said in his Theodicy, the question is asked, first of all, whence does evil come? Si
Deus est.
Si Deus est unde malum, si non est unde bonum. The answer is that it must be sought in the ideal nature of the creature insofar as this nature is contained in the eternal verities which are in the understanding of God, independently of his will. Or we must consider that there is an original imperfection in the creature before sin, because the creature is limited in its essence, whence ensues that it cannot know all and that it can deceive itself and commit other errors. God cannot prevent it, so evil, without acting against what he owes to himself, without doing something that would be worse than the crime of man, without violating the rule of the best, and that would be to destroy divinity, as I've already observed. God is therefore bound by a moral necessity, which is in himself to permit moral evil in creatures. Now, at least I have disposed of the cause of moral evil, physical evil, that is, sorry, someone help?
Sorrows, suffering, miseries.
Miseries will be less troublesome to explain, since these are results of moral evil. One suffers because one has acted. One suffers evil because one does evil. Nostrum causa malorum nos sumus. So, and here I venture a thought which maybe we can discuss later, how foolish this may be, but it came to me that if we accept the concept of divinity in general, then this Leibnizian conclusion seems to be in line with the mandate of heaven, doesn't it? Because it can be revoked, so to speak, if one does not do the right. So metaphysically, evil does not have to be punishment in this, or in this sense, punishment from God, so much as just a necessary consequence of a created world, with God remaining the loving creator, just as a parent is full of agapic love for their child after it touched on a hot stove, or even after a parent, after they received news from their offspring having committed a crime. Will they ever stop loving them? Anyway, so this is just something which I put in there as a note. And in conclusion, Leibniz says that some adversary not being able to answer this argument will possibly...
Perchance?
Sorry?
Perchance? Answer?
Will perchance, yeah, answer the conclusion by a counter-argument, saying that the world could have been without sin and without sufferings. But I deny that then it would have been better. I deny that then it would have been better. What must be known, that all things are connected in each one of the possible worlds. The universe, whatever it may be, is all of one piece, like an ocean. The least movement extends its effect there to any distance whatsoever, even though this effect becomes less perceptible in proportion to the distance. Therein, God has ordered all things before and for all, having
foreseen prayers,
good and bad actions, and all the rest. And each thing as an idea has contributed before its existence to the resolution that has been made upon the existence of all things, so that nothing can be changed in the universe, any more than in a number, save its essence, or, if you will, save its numerical individuality. Thus, if the smallest evil that comes to pass in the world were missing in it, it would no longer be this world, which, with nothing omitted and all allowance made, was found the best by the Creator who chose it. Now, since in the ideas of God there is an infinity of possible universes,
and since only one can exist,
there must be a sufficient reason for God's choice of that one, a reason that leads him to choose one rather than some other of the possible universes. And this reason can only be found in the suitability or degrees of perfection that these worlds contain, with each possible world's right to claim existence being proportional to the perfection it contains. And that is the reason for the existence of the best, which God's wisdom brings him to know, his goodness brings him to choose, and his power brings him to produce. Okay, so this was a lot of philosophical, theoretical background or essence of what Leibniz had put forth, and which was then called optimism. It was his, as I said, his Theodicy, which came from the discussions about the papers or the articles which were published in the dictionary of Bayle on the request of the King of Prussia. Anyway, so what about these? Again, remember that I said if you wanted to attack Leibniz, you would not have been able to attack him on his political, economical, scientific accomplishments, because they spoke for themselves. So you only had to had the chance to get to him via his theological system or his philosophical system, and this is exactly what they did, and how they did we will see here. So this term optimism was coined as a derogative term against the Leibnizian philosophical system by the French Jesuit Louis Bertrand Castel in a review of Leibniz's book Theodicy for the Journal de Thwart in 1737. So it was 27 years after the publication of the Theodicy, which had been very popular and undisputed basically before that. And as I said, 1732 was when the Russians claimed possession of the northwest of America, of the American continent. Then 5 years later, we begin to see that Leibniz was attacked, and this may not be a coincidence. So this term would become immensely popular in the following years as a mocking nickname against Leibniz's thought, or something that was considered to be Leibniz's thought. The most prominent came from Arthur Schopenhauer in the 19th century only. Earlier Voltaire with a poem, and then with the Candide, and of course the Prussian Academy of Sciences in the year 1755. The year 1755 is also important because it was the year where Lisbon had been struck by a devastating earthquake, and this was taken as a cause to get to Leibniz by asking how could this be true, that this was God's will, or God could have permitted such atrocities. And in this, then the whole thing got a whole new quality. But the Prussian contest was before this earthquake. Now Castell, I've phrased it an oligarchical view because I am, making a connection between his Jesuit priesthood and the powers which this has served. This is, of course, a little bit polemical, but be it as it may. He understood that Leibniz had. Sorry, what? Anyway, he had. Sorry. Yeah, he had understood that Leibniz and his attitude of creative reason was a threat to the oligarchy, and I have now here used a phrase which was also used in the 20th century for a British politician, but in a way, I think Leibniz was the best prime minister Britain never had. If we remember that by chance he was prevented from being becoming the prime minister due to the death of the Queen of Hanover and George getting access to the throne. Anyway, so this is, I think, it's not a coincidence that prominent Jesuit and a Jesuit journal from France began to take Leibniz down. He is a polymath. He has been a polymath. So in Germany, it's ein Universalgelehrter. But Castell, this priest, he made fun of this. And can I ask someone to read this next quote, because I think it will be completely chopped up if I try with this thing. Can someone read?
Yes, I can do it.
Yeah.
Castell on Leibniz. Born in Germany, this illustrious sage lived among all circles and in all nations of Europe, and trained his genius in one way or another in philosophy and geometry, which are in some manner the same field. He lived and worked in all fields, in all disciplines, in jurisprudence, in history, in chemistry, in medicine, in theology itself, and in metaphysics. Politician, physicist, naturalist, genealogist, anatomist, botanist, astronomer, alchemist, casuist, grammarian, and probably also Lutheran, Calvinist, Socinian, even Catholic, if this is possible. Leibniz was everything. He knew everything, wrote about everything, and wanted chiefly to conciliate everything.
Thank you. So, I mean, it is very obvious that this is a very, very bitter and cynical attack on Leibniz's vast spectrum of work, where he, in a way, gives away that the author of these lines is a Jesuit who I think have themselves a notoriety for doing or taking up every possible argument and cause, very much like the sophists did. This caricature, by the way, shows Castell at one or at his invention of a harmonium which was working on colors. If you had water vapor in the room and light, then it could be seen that the different colors were playing. So this obviously was a great sensation at the time. But it wasn't only Castell, it was also Voltaire and Kant, both published on philosophical optimism in 1759, so post Mendelssohn and the Berlin Academy, indicating that the attack on Leibniz had not been successful, and this is my conclusion from that. And it also was, I think it became obvious that the opposition to the attack on Leibniz needed controlling. It's noteworthy that Mendelssohn continued to defend the best of all worlds until his death. Eventually, he also realized that Kant would not come by. So Mendelssohn, when you read his letters to Kant, he was very going to great lengths to really get an understanding with Kant. But at last, in this last letter in 1785, he lets go, stating that we will not come together. This is something which, if you read the letters, is quite touching, I find. Now let's come to the Prussian Academy. As we've heard, it was founded by royal charter on an idea from Leibniz in 1700. Frederick the Great said that it was his grandmother who founded it, and in a way this is true, even though it was by edict or charter from the king. But the Royal Academy, or Royal Society as it was called, had lost royal support after Leibniz died and the new king had taken over. The French school of philosophy, I say they conspired to subvert the academy from very early on by staging first a private philosophical society in Berlin from 1720 onwards, and also by blocking efforts to develop the Leibnizian approach to philosophy in the society. They published a Bibliothèque Germanique under the pseudonym of Société Anonyme. When Frederick William I was about to die in 1740, Voltaire got very, very active and pressed hard for a revival of the academy under the new king, under French control. And so this is a quote from historian Adolf Harnack, who is in Germany, or used to be in the late 19th century, a very big name in history. He wrote on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the Society of the Berlin Academy that the more it became clear that the life of Frederick William was coming to an end, the more importunate Voltaire's letters became. Right, so you can see how desperate attempts were made to reestablish this academy as a weapon, as a counterculture weapon. It was revived by Frederick the Great, and it did have a strong anti-Leibnizian and French agenda. So this is also obvious by seeing that 3 times, 1747, 1751, and 1754, those contests which were staged after Frederick had reinvigorated the academy were directed against Leibnizian philosophy, his monadology, and the system of optimism. which for the patron of the society is, I think, quite a very telling, judgment. So now let's get to the contest in itself, and here I refer everyone to this article, Pope, a Metaphysician, which is the translation by Paul Gallagher from the winter issue 1999 of Fidelio. It was published anonymously, so this essay was published anonymously because, of course, it was written by both of them, and one of them being Moses Mendelssohn, who in 1754 he was not legitimately living in Berlin, so therefore they had to take great precautions anyway. Lessing on Mendelssohn on Pope. So this is from the official contest calling for papers. The Academy demands an examination of Pope's system, which, sorry, is there something behind? Which says it's
which is contained in the statement, all is good.
Right, thank you. And then it continues. So Lessing and Mendelssohn continue to say, if one were to want to make them into a canon according to which all questions enveloped therein were to be decided, more comfort than reason would come about thereby. So God has willed it to be so, and because he has willed it, it must be good, is truthfully a very easy answer, with which one is never left high and dry. But one is directed, but not enlightened. It is the most noteworthy piece of the worldly wisdom of fools. For what is more foolish than to take each and every event of nature as an indication of the will of God, without even considering whether the accident in question could have been an object of divine will. An investigation of Pope's system, I haven't been able to think about this without asking myself rather with astonishment, who is Pope? A poet. A poet? What business does Saul have among the prophets? What business does the poet have among the metaphysicians? But that's how the English are. Their great minds are always the greatest, and their rare heads must always be wonders. No fame appears enough to them, not even naming Pope the preeminent philosophical poet. They would have him be even so great as a philosopher as poet. That's it. They would have that impossibility, or they would take Pope to be greatly degraded as a poet. But they will certainly not have the latter. Thus, they will have the former. On the Leibnizian system, Mendelssohn and Lessing, so I will only very briefly have this here, but as an example, because the whole essay is brilliantly translated by Paul Gallagher, and again, I encourage you to read it. It's very, very subtle and sophisticated. No, it's not sophisticated because that's a negative connotation, but it is very, very well thought and written. Matt, would you please help with this first two lines?
Leibniz says, where different principles, rules of perfection are to be put together to make a whole, there necessarily some of the same must strike against one another.
And through this striking together, either contradictions must arise or exceptions must ensue on one side. The best of worlds is thus, according to him, that one in which the least such exceptions occur, and those to the least important principles. Now thence surely arise the moral and natural imperfections which we suffer in the world. Only they can make arise a higher ordering, which these exceptions have inescapably made. Had God permitted one evil less to arise in the world, he would have prevented a higher ordering, a more important principle of perfection from the side of which no such exceptions should occur. A few words on Mendelssohn and his situation in Prussia in particular, because again, after reading Cynthia's article on Hellen Keller and looking into optimism, I found this piece on Mendelssohn, and I also looked at his personal biography a bit more in depth. And so Mendelssohn, he was not Prussian. He was born in Dessau in Saxony, and he was only tolerated, right? So he did not have a legal permit to reside in Berlin, even years after being a renowned philosopher. So this led to a situation where in 1763, the French Marquis d'Argens convinced Mendelssohn. So he had met him, of course, because Mendelssohn had been a preeminent philosopher by the time already. And the Marquis, who had left France and toured basically Europe, but spent much time at the court of Frederick the Great, he convinced Mendelssohn to submit a request to the king to be granted official status for his whole family, which Mendelssohn was very reluctant to do because he feared that this would not be well received. Eventually he does it, but the king, Frederick II, never replies. But after Argens' intervention on what the state of the matter were, he said that, of course, he did grant the privilege, but it must have gotten lost in the mail. Okay, so then again, d'Argens wrote again to King Frederick with a very, I think, very interesting quotation. A bad Catholic philosopher begs a bad Protestant philosopher, so this is the king, to give the privilege to a bad Jewish philosopher. There's too much philosophy in all of this for reason not to be on the side of the demand. And eventually Mendelssohn got a privilege to be officially a resident of Prussia, but only he and not his family. So this is also something which only was healed later. Right, so Mendelssohn, because as I said, he was reluctant to apply even for this grace from the king, he referred to the philosopher's duty to accept his fate. And he quoted Socrates. Socrates proved to his friend Crition that the wise man is guilty and must die if the laws of the state demand it. I must therefore consider the laws of the state in which I live to be merciful if they merely expel me, considering that in the absence of a protective Jew, no Schlemiel, so this is a Jew who is considered less than a Jew, no Schlemiel is willing to acknowledge me as his servant. So therefore, Mendelssohn subsumed that his fate was quite necessary and well deserved. Anyway, so this is basically the end of my my presentation. I have a little bit of a polemic at the end, which is an image of what Leibniz has been used for and applauded for by the oligarchy. And basically, he was considered a piece of cake. And this is because in 1893, at the Expo, Columbian Exposition in Chicago, this cake, which is from Hanover, received a gold medal from
We can't hear you.
Yeah,
We can't
Uwe,
hear you.
your sound, Uwe, has cut off, unfortunately. Are you still there, Uwe? It's the weirdest thing. It just dropped off as soon as you showed the Leibniz cake. I could see your finger implying problem solving. Encourage people to think about a question or thought to share with Uwe as we are seeing mind in motion right now, the act of problem solving in the moment. We're observing creative process.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, sorry about that.
You've proven if you hadn't overcome this, the idea that we're living the best of all possible worlds would have been difficult to defend, but you did it.
Right. Yeah. So pertaining to the cake thing, I wanted to say that this is something where in 1893 Leibniz cake got gold medal at the Chicago Expo, which, if I'm not mistaken, was organized by J.P. Morgan's and his consorts. For they wanted to show that you could make a profit with world expos rather than show really the industrial capacity and the power of the American system. But that was a polemic.
Really, and that was the Chicago exposition of 1893.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a cynical joke almost to infuse that into the proceedings, eh? Like that's the only proof that the universe is good because there's cake.
I mean, so this company still exists today, and they still produce this Leibniz cake, which is of course something which refers to, I think, even truly Leibniz thinking about the provisions of armies in his days, and so he came on this. Apparently, that's the story. He must have come on this hard bread, and so this cake is a sweet variety of such hard bread, and it was used at least by the German army, who helped those oligarchical producers to make a fortune during World War II and probably even earlier.
Jerry just said the Chicago Expo was the worst of all possible expos. I agree. It really was. Yeah. Quan has a thought. Quan, go for it.
Hi, Uwe. Once again, an excellent presentation by you.
Thank you.
I would like to know, I have a comment on the link between the idea of theodicy and the degrees of perfection as in rapprochement with the mandate of heaven. But before I go on my ramblings, I would like to hear what you have to say about that rapprochement.
Well, it was not very detailed considerations which I had, but I think from my understanding of the mandate of heaven, which is an obligation to the king or to the emperor, it is also something which is a sign of, or taken as a sign of certain harmonies between those administrations and the good of the people. So therefore, that is something where if it is not acted upon, which will lead to it being reversed or revoked, or the fortunes being lost. And this is something which I think is a way of how to look at this concept of punishment, which is in a couple of articles is referred to even explicitly by Leibniz. Of course, it is the time which this was written, so 320 years ago. Therefore, the the state of discussion was certainly different from what it would be today. But this is how I try to make sense of how Leibniz would come to be arguing natural catastrophes as being a sign of sinful conducts on the part of the creatures or whatever. I must admit it's not a very well-reasoned idea which I put forth here, so I apologize in advance.
Oh no, but I think that you were speaking of the political dimension of the mandate of heaven. And have you finished your comment for me
Yes.
to give my comment? Okay, my comment about the rapprochement between the perfection of being, or the idea that we are in the best of all possible worlds, is precisely in line of that notion of mandate of heaven, but let's say in the extended meaning of the mandate of heaven. Because what I like very much in your presentation precisely was about that all that exists is wholly perfect. And I make the rapprochement of the mandate of heaven in that very fundamental idea of degrees of perfection, and that we are in the best of all possible worlds, because if the universe has been less complicated or less developed, with less rooms of perfection, maybe we would have a universe with less accidents or with less evils, but it would have also given a universe that would be less interesting, let's say. So there is a kind of a balance between the different rooms of perfection for precisely generating that most perfect of all possible universe. And what I mean to say too is that that mandate of heaven, beyond the political justification, which is very right, is also the link between ontology, epistemology, and politics, in the sense that you focus rightly a lot on the ontological aspect in your presentation of the Theodicies, meaning that what is complete is perfect. So what's evil is precisely what is not complete in being. So, and it goes precisely that the fundamental given, if you want, is ontological, but because we are people in time and not in timelessness, we have precisely to go on that epistemological growth precisely to be in connection with the foundational given, which is the ontological reality. And because of that epistemological growth, the political aspect would be correlated depending on the degree of epistemological growth precisely. So I would like to say that your presentation today is very close to the Chinese notion of the mandate of heaven as being precisely the direct correlation of the intrinsic unity, I prefer to say that, okay? The intrinsic unity between the ontological given, the epistemological growth to be precisely as close as possible to that ontological being at the start, and which would be translated in political acts precisely. And once again, I don't have to tell you, since you mentioned that in your last presentation, that intrinsic unity of ontology, epistemology, and politics is synthesized in Chinese culture by the 6 lines of the hexagrams, right? And that is precisely that the intrinsic unity, that is the mandate of heaven. I would push as far, but it would take more reflection for sure, that theodicy in the Leibnizian sense is almost another way for speaking about the mandate of heaven. I stop here.
Yeah. So thank you, Juan. Again, I must admit I was a bit apprehensive already by putting down this note, but then I said, let's go for it, because it is always very, 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 very inspiring to have such interventions and discussions, interventions from you and discussions with you and with everyone else as well. But so the whole point I was really trying to make, which I realized I haven't done so well, because at the end I forgot to wrap it up again, is that my point was this system of philosophy of philosophical optimism, the best of all possible worlds, is something which is surely very, very fundamental. Maybe not even really completely understood by most people, certainly not by most people, possibly by a few, but that it was in this context, it was used, in the early 18th century by the opponents of Leibniz's political and economical and practical work to get to him, to discredit him, to make him appear as someone who, as we heard, has something to say about everything and doesn't know what he's talking about really, because he is a heretic or a fool or whatever they want to interpret into this. And this was a political counter activity against this very, very fundamental and blossoming work of Leibniz's, as I said. And so my hypothesis was that 1732, the claiming of Russia's land claim in North America, that was something which I would assume did shake the world of the British Empire.
Yeah, I would like to take another 30 seconds, if with your permission, Uwe. There is a dialogue by Plato that is very close to that notion. That is the Eftithro, because in the Eftithro, the subject was precisely piety, but piety here understood as wholeness. And here, I think that the central notion of the Leibnizian theodicy is precisely what is perfect is whole. And in that Eftithro, the really central notion is the idea of the wholeness of being, precisely. And a small detail, in French, everything that ends with ism is always a small, an inferior notion. Okay, I give a practical example. A sovereignty in French is souveraineté. It ends with T. Okay, but if you want to mock a sovereignty, you would say souverainisme. Okay, isme is like in optimism, and I would say that French is a language that is open to many of those fine distinction. And I think that you were very right to stress that the Jesuits was coining the word optimism as a mocking concept. I stop here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I liked also I really appreciated your whole presentation, but the connection you're making as a hypothesis to the concerted effort to begin the assault on Leibniz's ideas and the opening up also of Russia and the Arctic and the Americas specifically, and that's a really important, I think, lead for scholars and researchers to explore and to follow up on. And I was reminded also of Vitus Bering, who appears to have been, I mean, he made his voyages of exploration into the Arctic and discovered the Bering Strait about 9 years after Leibniz died. And it does seem as though there was a direct connection between the sponsorship, Peter the Great's sponsorship of Bering's efforts to explore the Bering Strait and to see if there is a connection between the old and the new worlds, and Leibniz's direct grand strategy for the industrialization and exploration of Russia. So there's so many different points that just keep on folding back into this universal history, right? That's been shaping so much of our past and our current situation as well. Kevin had a thought. Kevin Vizet.
Yeah, Visser actually, but
Oh, Visser. Okay, I thought you were Quebecois. So, all right.
yeah, I am, but the English kind.
Right.
I have a question about, you mentioned inside, how could God permit such atrocities, right, regarding to the earthquake? And I see that happening even now, right? Like in terms of people believing in God or not believing. It's like, well, if God exists, and how could this happen? How could this happen? How could this happen? So I see that belief a lot. So I was just curious, did Leibniz have an answer to that in terms of the way he was thinking?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, he did not, of course, obviously did not comment on the earthquake of 1755 because he was dead by then. But in general, if I understand it correctly, he said that those were happenings which, well, reasonably must be connected in some way with the shortcomings of man, man's development, so man's imperfections. I'm not sure really whether I understand this already so much as to really give a concise answer to this. But certainly, this is something where he said that to expect God to be there for humans, to be to have a joyful life or an easy life, that's completely missing the point, because that's not what creation was intended, or was why God created in the first place. He created to have this development, to have this process, and this is something which will leave the question of what is the meaning of injustices or catastrophes happening in nature. I'm not too comfortable in venturing in this uncharted territory, at least uncharted for me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Monty, did you want to share your thought, your observation?
Thank you so much. Absolutely astonishing. The thing brought together so much for me, and so far as like what Matt referred to as the talk about the land bridge back in 1732, which was phenomenal. I'm also, what struck me was Benjamin Franklin, I understand, also came up with this idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which as an unalienable right, which he replaced. It was initially supposed to be life, liberty, and property, but he did get that from Leibniz. It's my understanding. But how much this applies to today also is completely relevant to me, given what we're seeing with Russia, with China, and what's happening with the West in this coming to loggerheads over these basic issues. And my comment in the comments, I was struck by the fact that Schiller wrote the Ghosts here in the late 1700s, which talked about the Venetians manipulating certain figures in this area, which brought about the 30 Years' War, which was a religious war. So there must have been much happening, much turmoil in this time with Leibniz and this battle ensuing insofar as the rights of man. That's just my comment.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, thank you, Monty. The ghost seer and Schiller's approach to the to the Venetian way of working all sides basically in order to cause the chaos which enables them to profit from the ensuing chaos is something, and to use black magic or whatever for this purpose is something which is of course very, very much connected to the kind of activity which Leibniz was against, and where he was the target also of vicious attacks. That's for sure, at least to my feeling. I've put in the chat a link. It's only available on the web archive, but that's about the science of happiness, from an old, I think it was EIR publication, which goes into this, and there's also some other talks which are available about the connections between Leibniz and the founding fathers. So he was, he was in London. Therefore, he was he was under the patronage of Sophie, right, who would have become queen, but died before Queen Anne died. And therefore there is this direct connection to I think even to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and to the whole thinking of the American founding fathers way before Franklin. And Franklin was certainly one of the most enlightened, well, not enlightened, but the most wise and prudent leaders to really insist upon this distinction of a proper understanding of the purpose of the whole project of the United States, and in securing the right to happiness, that is the right for every man and every woman to pursue what is given to them by divine, from the divine.
Yeah, thank you.
Scott had, I think, some considerations pertaining to Leibniz's work on China as well. Specifically, he referenced Leibniz's writings from China, his sort of newspaper, to popularize Chinese Confucian thought into Europe. Scott, are you still there? Scott? Okay. Well, I guess I don't know if that's something you want to comment on, or if you've looked at that in your research. Was Leibniz's conceptions of, I guess, but you and Quan kind of already implicitly hit upon it. His thoughts of China and Russia as an intermediary between Chinese and European civilizations in greater detail. Though again, in your class, you did touch upon that from his letter.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, to my understanding, which is rudimentary, but I think Leibniz was very, very fascinated by the level of civilization which China had, developed to long before Europe had even gotten close to anything resembling this kind of cultural development. So therefore, he was looking for information also from China to learn from it, and to connect the various cultures with the best of each other, as he said to Tsar Peter. Right, it is something to use to the betterment of humanity, basically, and that's why he was so open, and so free also from narrow theological limitations which there might have been facing a culture which was non-Christian. I think he had no problems with that. Even he had a deep understanding of the similarities between the search for the mandate of heaven, or the search for the divine.
Mm.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are, Scott. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi. Yeah, okay. I just couldn't get my audio going there for a little bit. Yeah, I'm so intrigued just to I came late, so I missed most of it, and the mandate of heaven. I heard that little bit of it, and the connection to the best of all possible worlds. A lot of people don't know. I was blown away when I discovered the Leibniz connection to China when Matt first told us about that. That still leaves an enigma of, a greater world. So just wondering, yeah, I mean, for people here to check into that, there's a wonderful book that I posted a link to on Amazon, written by two American scholars about his work. And there's a fair bit on the Schiller Institute, I think, in the Fidelio magazine about it. But I just think, isn't it serendipitous that it will be the Chinese that will revive Leibniz's work and bring it back to us, essentially, and only the Chinese that can really actually do that at this point in time, probably. So anyway, just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Scott. I agree. It is very, very telling that Leibniz should be forgotten in Europe, basically. Where he's not forgotten, he is certainly tried to be ridiculed or at least diminished. I mean, they cannot get around the fact that he invented the calculus, and so therefore mathematics is something where here in Hanover, I'm living close to Hanover. Of course, university is named in after Leibniz, so therefore they cannot get around it, but they completely distort the whole approach to life from Leibniz, as it is, I think, has become clear from the quotes we heard about with Tsar Peter the Great, where he said, "I'm not a patriot in any narrow sense. I'm a citizen of the world of humanity, and I believe that it is our duty to develop this to the glory of God, which is the creator, which is something which is, from your European standpoint, is Christian, and there's a lot to this Christian Platonic approach and philosophy and even in a way doctrine, but it is something which must be compatible to other civilizations, at least in principle for Leibniz. So far, I will go to say that, even though, as I said, I'm way out of my depth here and talking about something which I'm only just beginning to explore, and I'm equally fascinating as you are about this whole breadth of interest and productivity and creativity. I mean, certainly the whole approach of science, we know that Aristotle versus Plato is something which also has left its toll on the way we do science, but certainly Leibniz was a polymath, and I think his approach would have encouraged other people also to have this generalist approach to science, as opposed to the silo approach of narrow expertism, which will necessarily lead to a loss of understanding of the irreducible complexity of life.
Yeah, I think it's also, there's something to do with the commitment to solve problems that are in alignment with truth. If as soon as you have a real authentic intention to solve serious authentic problems and you're committed to it, you need a philosophy that will allow you to actualize the means to do the job. And in a society that is not governed by that type of intention, there's all sorts of space for fakery, illusionist models that look pretty or elegant but have no usefulness. There's no testability, and you can see that for much of the models promoted in the climatological, scientific, economic fields. There's all sorts of space for kooky theories that are untestable and that, when actually acted upon, only make things worse. because there's no intention to really solve problems. Whereas when you look at a society as China is exhibiting in its current manifestation, a real intention to do things that are of excellence and that demand quality of ideas to be creative and make discoveries, you need a philosophy that will accommodate that. And so it would make sense that a more fertile soil is being provided for Leibniz's philosophy to blossom, which is a completely other paradigm from everything that we are accustomed to encountering when we think of philosophy or science. It's like there's words that are similar, but it's a totally different paradigm. It's very difficult to shift gears and get into the mind of the Leibnizian paradigm, but it's so much more healthy when you do that shifting. And you can see why the oligarchy would be so afraid of that being the basis of everything, right? Schools of architecture, science, historiography, and it. As his enemy, the Jesuit, pointed out, yeah, he really was. He excelled in everything, like a Da Vinci character. Everything he devoted his passion to, he made breakthroughs in those fields, and he saw them all as different sides of the same thing. So yeah, a very good irony that China would be, ironically and lawfully, a place where his ideas would be blossoming again today. Now, Jerry has a consideration on the best of all possible worlds, a question, and then I see Irina and Kwan. So Jerry, then Irina, then Kwan.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks very much, Uwe. This is really given me a lot of food for thought. And you reminded me of something. When I first came across this idea of Leibniz, the best of all possible worlds, I was thinking along the lines that, you can think of it in terms of philosophically or morally the best of all possible worlds. But I was thinking it actually also applies physically. This planet we're on is the best of all possible worlds. It has, this potential for evolution. Life is here. It's evolved. It's got potential for even more evolution. And it's because nowadays you have all these UFO fantasies and, the science fiction and all this stuff about aliens. And to me, they're not only, on the one hand, they're not only wishing for other possible worlds, but I think they're hoping for it, that they're wishing for a more advanced world, more advanced aliens to come here, because then they can say, see, we're not the best of all possible worlds. There's others. And I think it's, if we assume we're the best of all possible worlds, contrary, I've seen no evidence of other aliens, then we have a certain responsibility to be the best of all possible worlds. I mean, if we are the only planet in the universe with intelligent life, then we can't allow World War III. We can't allow that kind of destruction. And even though we have volcanoes and earthquakes and floods and everything, it's still the best of all possible worlds when you think of that way. And so I had this idea that if Leibniz is right, and this is the best of all possible worlds, then we have to assume that responsibility, that it is the best of all possible worlds. And anyway, that's something I was thinking about earlier, and Uwe, you've just brought it all flooding to the front again, and I wanted to thank you for that, and maybe you have a comment on that yourself.
Actually, I do. Thank you, Gerald. And thank you for reading those large parts. I really enjoy listening to your voice, not only when it's my slides, but generally you have a way of presenting which is very, very inviting to come along and follow the thought. Anyway, so yeah, I have a comment on this particular point of the best of all possible worlds. I mean, this is something where Leibniz does indeed argue from a particularly Christian standpoint. The whole thing is about whether this idea is compatible with Christianity, with the doctrines of Christianity. And he says, of course it is, where other people have various objections to it, or say that the way he explains it is objectionable, and are in a way much more fatalistic or whatever. And Leibniz makes the point that it is up to us to reduce the amount of suffering, to reduce the amount of catastrophes, to reduce the amount of sin in the world. But if we, I mean, I have also wondered that the whole idea basically just only sets in after the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, right? So this is the world we are in as mankind. We have been expelled from the Garden of Eden according to this belief. Therefore, the creation, which was before it, okay, does possibly even allow for a world without those kinds of sufferings. Therefore, it would be one more reason to not. Well, I mean, I think it is. At least I have an urge or a need to maybe not see God as someone who is, shaking his finger and being punitive, but rather some other kind of father or parent or whatever you want to. I'm aware that this is now venturing again into treacherous ground. I'm not trying to make any point about genders or whatever. But the thing is that this is something where I must admit that, yeah, what we are experiencing is the world after the tree of knowledge, right? The tree of good and evil, and this is something where we have to find a way to reconcile ourselves with this idea of creation as is set out in the Christian belief in the Bible, with whatever this means, to go out and have death, and which wasn't present in the Garden of Eden, but we chose our free will, and the concept of free will is something which is essential to Leibniz's philosophy, and is also essential to the critics of him, because he was criticized of committing heresy against God by saying that he could have chosen otherwise. The concept of free will for God is something which he did have, which he violated against. I'm not sure I understand all of those arguments, but I know they existed, and therefore it is very, very complex and needs needs good time to think about what this could mean. But certainly Leibniz sees that we have the capacity and the obligation to reduce suffering, to develop humanity to a higher level, in the way even Schiller also believed and wrote about it and created great art.
Irina asked me to just read this one out. Though I mean, you've been sort of addressing this implicitly, but I don't know if there's anything more you'd like to say on this. What were the detractors of Leibniz trying to prove exactly? In a nutshell, what was their counter argument?
Yeah, well, as I said, there are a number of camps which were hitting on Leibniz. So it was those who said that this is not in line with Christian dogma, or that he was naive and not to be taken serious. But the whole idea that someone, which was my point I tried to make, is that someone had to be got at from a sophistry had to be committed against him Essentially, that's what I would say, and it doesn't matter really. I'm not even sure whether there was a consistent argument against him or whether it was multiple shades of gray, so to speak, which people tried to launch against him in order to somehow, limit his attraction.
Yep. Quan.
Okay, so what a synchronicity, because when I raised my hand, it was to offer a partial answer to Irina's question precisely. And I would say that there was no real argument from the adversaries of Leibniz that Uwe pointed out very rightly. I would say that it's more a propaganda movement or propaganda maneuvers, because their standpoint is precisely to uphold the oligarchical perspective. And a very simple way to define operationally the oligarchical perspective is that everything in life is viewed as a reward or a punishment. Okay, a reward or punishment given by a king, a prince, or by natural reality. And that is precisely that mindset that has to be transcended for mankind precisely to explode its creative potential. Because as long that you are under the impression that everything that happens to you is either a kind of punishment or a kind of reward, you don't go to the third solution, if I may say so, meaning developing your own creative power or going into the epistemological development precisely. So let's not forget that Theodicy is precisely the subtitle of Uwe's presentation today, meaning it's about what Theodicy is about, the man's freedom, essentially, God's goodness, and the existence of evil. So, but I would say that the central point is really man's freedom, in the sense that if you see things, if the propaganda was successful, I would say that if we see the political development of the last 2 centuries, the propaganda was to a certain extent successful, because most people see things still under the viewpoint of punishment or reward, and not as a possibility for them for developing their creative power. And that was exactly the goal of the people who contradicts the Leibnizian's ideas. And I would say that something among their arguments that would be a little bit close to an intellectual argument is precisely the idea of God's omnipotence as arbitrariness, rather than as the intrinsic unity precisely of the ontological reality, the epistemological growth, and the political construction. So if you see things as those three, once again, I think that some people know that I like very much the form called triangle. So you have that interaction between precisely the ontological reality, the epistemological growth, and the political construction. If you see things like that, it would help to develop your creative power rather than to be in the pendulum between punishment and reward precisely. And once again, it's about the wholeness, or to be healthy. And I repeat again that Plato has created a dialogue about that, which is the Ftfro, and that the Chinese tradition presented as the 6 lines of the epistemological development called as the hexagram. So destroying beauty too is part of the propaganda machine for preventing people precisely to go to that development of their creative power. I stop here.
Yeah, thank you. Juan, I couldn't agree more. And again, it's always such a pleasure to hear you and all the colleagues here explain in much more eloquency things which you have been studying much longer than I have. It helps me a lot. I would like to share for a moment my last slide, which I didn't show, but which touches this at least a little bit. So I asked myself the question, why evil would be an integral part of oligarchy, and I came to the conclusion that if you have something where Götterfunken, as in ode to joy, the divine sparks of creativity, the inalienable rights, this concepts being disseminated, being understood, gaining traction, this would be an existential threat to anyone who wanted to be among the few ruling about the many. So therefore, evil would have to persist, wouldn't it? Right? You would have to prove idealists wrong. You would have to make them appear as though they wouldn't know what they're talking about. And that's, in my view, is the only way to cover up discoveries of those great minds such as Pythagoras, Plato, Augustine, Nicholas of Cusa, Kepler, Leibniz, Franklin, Schiller, many more, Riemann, Gauss. So this is something which is a necessity for the oligarchy. So they have to invest in keeping this evil thing going, and by doing so, of course, perfection is prevented, which could explain the persistence of physical evil, or even the increased magnitude of that in the world. That's a perfectly plausible idea to me, at least to my limited capacity, and therefore I think the challenge might be thinking along the lines of Christ, of Jesus, right? Which would be love your enemies. What would the answer be? How would we oppose those forces of evil without increasing even more the level of imperfection? And that's a very difficult question to answer. I just felt inspired to share this last slide, which I had thought of not showing, but yeah, forgive me.
No, that's great, and it sort of speaks to what was just written in the chat box by Nikki, which really spoke to me when she wrote it, saying, when I first heard of this, part of me was just relieved to hear my intrinsic optimism wasn't just a trauma response. To reduce the amount of suffering is part of perfection of the world. Hard to understand as humans. I completely identify with that, Nikki. Like, is there something wrong with my desire to hold on to optimism when you discover more and more sickness and ugliness to the world? But no, it's actually, that's a very healthy, natural thing. It's just, it has to be beefed up, as you've just pointed out, with real knowledge of evil, and real knowledge and real heavy, hard, rigorous mental work to justify the optimism. If you don't do the work and you just hold on to the emotion, it will work against you. Then it becomes a trauma response, I guess, or something like that. But very good observation. Richard Moore.
Okay, we've been given a world in which we were able to evolve into humans and develop our understanding and gain the power to control our own destiny. So to ask for more than that would make us spoiled brats. And that's my understanding of best of all possible worlds.
Well said. Uwe, what do you think?
I'm sorry, I was distracted because I was answering a question in the chat. So therefore, Richard, could you please repeat? I'm sorry about this.
It's worth repeating, Richard. Actually, it's a simple, insightful little observation. I like your proof. Go for it.
Okay. So we've been given a world in which we were able to evolve, become humans, develop our understanding, and gain the power to control our own destiny. And to ask for more than that would make us spoiled brats as a species.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Ken Freeland, I see your hand, but you're on mute. Ken Freeland. Going once, going twice. All right. Ken Freeland might be able to get it back, but he was also the last one to stand up in line. So I'm going to throw it out there for anybody who has something pressing they want to get off their chest.
Can I speak?
Oh, you got in there, Ken. All right.
Oh, wow.
All right, go
This
for
is
it.
tricky. Okay. So first of all, Uwe, thank you for that most recent comment after Quan spoke, because I think we could do a whole webinar on just that problem that you're broaching there. And I would love to do that, actually. So how to counter evil without increasing the evil in the world and so forth. Anyway, to Quan's point, I was struck, Quan, by your description of the oligarchical approach as answering also the description of Skinnerian behaviorism, which reached its crescendo right around the time when the neocons were starting to poke their heads through at academia. And I just wondered if you see that correspondence there, kind of a sinking. That's it. Thanks.
Was a question for me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, of course. I mean, it's part of the oligarchical endeavor, but I don't want to give the word endeavor to the oligarchs. It's part of the oligarchical maneuvers to restrict the freedom of man, precisely. Okay, because I want to repeat that because I think I like the way it is expressed. Theodicy, precisely, is about man's freedom, God's goodness, and the existence of evil. And man's freedom is the epistemological growth. God's goodness is the ontological reality, and the existence of evil is the political construction. So theodicy is truly that triangle of man's freedom, God's goodness, and the existence of evil. So everything in the psychological dimension that would restrict that freedom, okay? But because when we say freedom, it's almost equal to the power of creativity. There are more things in freedom, of course, but it's essentially the power of creativity. And it's part of the power of creativity that's not to see things happening in the universe and in our social universe or in the physical universe, our psychological universe, as either punishment or reward. And the Skinnerian psychology is precisely a very primitive psychology, reducing everything to punishment or reward. Even Freudian psychology, that I don't see as so developed than that, would allow more than punishment and reward. But just to tell you to what extent Skinnerian psychology is utterly primitive and grotesque. And of course, it is part of the oligarchs' maneuver to restrict the freedoms of man and the capacity of expressing man's power of creativity, of course.
Yeah, well, I think you made the point that it serves to pull us away from the epistemological journey. And I think it could be argued that if we're not engaged in the epistemological journey, then we're susceptible to exactly that control ideology. It's the epistemological journey that actually frees us from it, as it were. Okay, that's it.
Okay.
That's good. That's good. Well, this was very edifying, I gotta say. This was very good. Jerry also just wrote in the comment section, support of optimism. C.S. Lewis says that good does not require evil in order to exist, but evil does require good in order to exist. I like that. That's another simple, elegant proof, very Augustinian. I like it. I think Leibniz would like it too. He would approve. Um, so I think, yeah, there's going to be a lot when we upload this class. We're going to make sure I often say it and then I forget, but I'm going to make sure that we upload all of the links to the many reference material that Uwe had brought up, from Hellen Keller's on optimism to all of the material that was brought up. I took notes this time around, so people can do a bit of homework. Also, the collected writings, as much as I could find, Cynthia and I, when we scrambled to find as many English translations of Leibniz's original works and supplementary material that we thought had high value, that's available in a link in the Rising Tide Foundation's Library of Alexandria. So that's in the chat box, but also in the description box, which people can review. I'd highly recommend the discourses on metaphysics, but that's my personal favorite. Other people might find something that resonates more to their soul. But until then, thank you so much, Uwe, for doing this. This is the first class of this topic that I've seen taken up in my living memory. So I think you did great justice to this. And I think it also sets the stage, like I said, to next week, where we're going to begin a symposium that'll go on for maybe 12 weeks or so on explorations of the American system, where Sam Labriere, who delivered that lecture you cited that inspired you on Leibniz and cameralism, will be opening up with something on the science of protectionism and the American system more broadly. We're going to have Anton Chaikin, Nancy Spanis, a couple of the Holmes family youth who will be also tackling FDR and Lincoln's greenback. So it'll be a really thorough thing. And I think it's a good timing, since the hunger to understand this with the incoming Trump administration, I'm noticing, is extremely high. There's a big thirst to understand this forgotten Leibnizian tradition baked into America's past. So I think that, the inauguration in the US is going to be a good time to kick that off. So I hope to see everybody there, and feel free to invite more people to expand this. We can, I think, have a few hundred guests at a time in these Zoom meetings. So let's fill it to capacity if possible over the coming weeks. And yeah, this is good. So Uwe, once again, yeah, thank you. And thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.